Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Robin, again for the introduction and for setting the scaffold for what we want to accomplish today. There's no mistake or no accident or chance that we put training first. We have a flow to today that we really have set out to help guide us through getting the most out of what we can get out of today. We are starting with training, and after that we want you to think about the rest of this conference in terms of your training program. So we're going from training into a manifestation of training and emergency response, and as Robin explained, then we're going to take that into transporting people, reporting on what happened, and then treating injuries. So when you have a training program, it's good if you have a plot. Think about that for yourselves as you are critically evaluating your own training program as employers in silviculture and forestry. That's the purpose of this, is to get you thinking about the progression of skills and competencies that you want to foster in your employees, and to be critical of your training programs, to think about the structure of them, think about the role they play in your company, and to look at them, most importantly, as tools for achieving change. As the advocate, I get to see the gap between what happens in the SAC room, in the Strategic Advisory Committee room with the BC Safe Forestry Program, and what happens in the field. And I see that gap very acutely. My goal is to try to help bridge some of that gap between our safety program and the field, but it's up to you to build the receptive devices, the training programs where you can take our information and start translating it into practice. And we're really trying to turn the corner in that respect, and that is why we're putting the emphasis on training today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on. In a broad picture sense, we want to go from here as a training program to here as a training program. To go to something structured where there's a plot, there's a narrative. I also want to talk a little bit about pitfalls in the field. Get that out of the way first. Don't want to dwell on the negative today, but to talk a little bit about some of the things that we see and how this is informing the things that we want to do. We see failures to track in the field. I personally see that a lot. I see companies that do training, they're not tracking it, they're not keeping a spreadsheet of what's going on. And that becomes a problem when they don't know who needs renewed training, or they're duplicating, or they're missing people that need it. I see orientations conducted as training. I see a single sheet of paper that has been basically signed by the trainee, maybe not even by the trainer. Quite often I see these, a term that was introduced to me, pencil whipped. I see training programs where you can tell by the angle of the check marks that the person never actually moved their elbow. Recently, when I was doing an audit, somebody was explaining to me how they actually analyzed the handwriting of the training documents to see whether or not people actually paused to review the information, or if they just basically did a whole series of check marks. We see online systems without assessment. We've started to turn the corner into using new technology for training, and we're seeing some really good innovation out there. There's been a few systems that have been around for a while, but increasingly this year I've seen 4 or 5 new online training systems develop. But too often these training programs are being delivered without an assessment to follow. So that's another one of the gaps that we're looking at. Training out of context in forestry. People that are accepting a driver's license as training and then assuming that that is sufficient for driving in a forestry environment, which we know to be false. If you're driving on bush roads, water bars, etc., looking at the context of what we're doing. We see knowledge transfer without verification. People are getting a lot of information, but what steps are we actually taking to make sure that they know what they've been given, or that they know what they've read, that they remember it, that they can apply the information? Experience used in the place of training. You hire somebody who has 2 or 3 years in surveying or brush cutting or something, and you assume they're trained. But we should know that with the flaws out there, or the gaps and the vulnerabilities in training, that is not a sufficient substitute for verifying the competency of these people or training them yourself. Most importantly, as an auditor, and this is, I think, where it hits home for training, where the biggest opportunities are, over and over again, I see recurring safety problems without training adjustment. I see companies that'll have repeated problems with, let's say, ATV rollovers, or people that are having the same types of ergonomic injuries from the way they do their job, and I'm not seeing an adjustment in their training program. That's the #1 tool for correcting those kinds of issues. And missed opportunities for integrating training with other tasks. So the opportunity to integrate training with your coaching, with your quality assessment, integrating training with your corrective actions that come after investigations. So these are some of the general pitfalls that have been observed in the field. There's some good stuff too. I get to see the good stuff. I definitely want to highlight that. I do see cases where people are doing more than reading and more than talking. Some companies are really starting to take steps to assess their workers, give them grades that aren't just a pass, fail, or perfect all the time. They're actually giving them graduated input on their progress, that they're revisiting training over time. Instead of just repeating, they're revisiting and growing their training and evolving it and starting to do different things. That we're starting to structure some of the training to match learning capacities. More and more, I see people using different media. Scooter, for example, using some of his multimedia. It really helps the fact that there's people out there with different learning capacities and different learning strengths. Not everybody is going to learn really effectively from a book or from hearing a speech. Some people need to do, and I think the nature of the tasks that we have out there are really important that people do. Seeing training delivered in different languages. One of my early audits was reviewing a company that had translated every word, not only of their training program, but of the health and safety accord of the BC forest industry into Punjabi. I was just absolutely blown away by this. The amount of energy that must have taken was immense. I can't actually read Punjabi, so I can't verify that it was accurate, but I assume it was. Like, it was tremendous effort. I'm starting to see more people put it into French, which is very important considering that maybe plus minus 20% of our industry is Francophone when it comes to the silviculture sector. I know that varies through some of the other sectors, but certainly in brushing, certainly in firefighting. New options in technology. Picture there of what they're doing in some of the harvesting sectors with machine simulators. And more evaluation of trainers. I have to say, one of the things that really makes me feel good is when I see owners of companies being really critical on themselves, when I see sort of a how to deliver a meeting book on the seat of an owner's truck. I see a lot of self-improvement by owners. Those are the kinds of positive signs that I'm seeing in the industry. So to talk a little bit here about competency, I want to talk about some of these concepts. It's important. In the SAC meeting today, we talked a little bit about the building blocks of competency-based training, that there's 3 essential pieces here. Why this is important is that I noticed that there is a difference in the words used in our committee room as what I hear in the field, and I think that one of the things that we're going to be looking to do is to introduce some new words and new concepts and get people comfortable with some of the building blocks of what good training programs focus on. Knowledge, for example. I would say that this is probably the strong point of the industry right now. We seem to be very focused on transferring knowledge to people and assuming that that is training. It's an essential component, but it doesn't stand alone. Knowledge does have to be acquired. It's theories, facts, procedures, etc., applied to a task, but it's only one part of competency. Attributes is another important part, which is characteristics or qualities that can be possessed or nurtured within a person. People come, they have natural attributes. Part of your recruitment and assessment program should be assessing the attributes of your staff, and that should be an ongoing basis, and identifying what attributes that need to be worked on and improved. And of course, skill, doing something well. This has to be practiced. Most importantly, these are all observable, measurable, linked, and transferable, and performance-based. I want to focus on one of them, which is transferable, because this is going to come up a bit later. A lot of the training competencies that we should be looking at, we should be looking at them as transferable within our sectors, within our industry, within forestry. That's good for our workers that we want to develop into people that are going to be long-time members, hopefully stay and work for more than 2 or 3 years, and start doing other jobs in forestry. That is a benefit of having rounded employees that will come back year after year that you can help find other work. It's also good for the company. It allows you to start looking for other opportunities when you have a training program that focuses on the transferability of your knowledge, attributes, and skill. Now, this is more than just presentation speak. This is industry direction. There is a trend in the industry towards competency-based training. The BC Forest Safety has been looking at standardized competencies that they want to develop for forestry industry occupations. They're starting with stand tending. The goal of this is to provide resources to develop workers who are competent, to assess gaps and help develop training plans and produce learning resources and assessment tools. And I just want to go into that a little bit about why this is being done and where it's coming from. This isn't about setting a certification course or something that people have to do. It's about providing a standard and a resource that people will be able to use. For those members of the industry that are still critically evaluating their training program, unsure of what level they need to reach or should reach or what the ideal content is, the goal is to develop assessment tools and content that you can apply and plug in. This will be tremendously beneficial for people that don't have that internal capacity or maybe are small enough of a company that they don't want to go and invest in an entire new training program, that there's going to be tools that they can use. And the process that they're going about this is this piloting, testing, revision, and use. We are drawing on subject matter experts from the field. I've been a part of this process for several years. We've gone about this as how we did the Resource Road Driving course, which I think is really one of the flagships of the Safe Forestry program that's really made a difference, is that we bring people in from the industry. These standards do not stand still. They will grow over time. But this idea of competency-based training, it's an industry direction that goes beyond even British Columbia. This is something that's happening in forestry colleges around the world, throughout North America. It's part of building a profession, and it's also part of branding for a job. That when workers and people go into an industry and they start looking at what they're going to get out of it, that becomes an attractant to the job, and that should be very relevant for us as a forestry and silviculture sector when we face the challenges of acquiring new people and how are we going to compete for them when everybody else in British Columbia is targeting that same workforce. What can we offer to get them in the door? And I think our training program needs to be one of the strong points in achieving that goal. So, putting it in the context of today, training in 2019 and beyond. Training doesn't stand still. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's what we consider satisfactory training today is absolutely different from what would have been satisfactory training 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And the way we deliver it has to be sensitive to some of these changes that are happening. The volume increase in worker demand, I think that's something, maybe that's particularly relevant for the tree planting contractors, but I think it has relevance for all of the forestry and silviculture contractors, is that we don't know exactly how this demand for labor is going to play out, but it's certainly going to affect different companies differently. And I would not assume that it is only the high turnover companies, the people that rely on a lot of young college and university students. I would not assume that they will be the only ones affected. They're the ones who have a tremendous amount of pressure on their training program. They have to be able to sort of mass batch process their workers and get them up to speed quickly and get them up to speed where they're making money in time. But even for the veteran companies, they are perhaps, in my opinion, from what I've seen, at times more vulnerable because they haven't faced that pressure in the past. They've had the luxury of sitting back, picking off the experienced young workers from other companies, and their training demands have actually been sort of supplemented or supported by the hard efforts of some of these particularly northern contractors. We can't assume that the same supply and demand of workers is going to be the same in the future. We talk about reaching that new norm. We're seeing some significant changes in the market in terms of prices that workers are being paid, what companies are offering to workers to keep them around. If that supply of third and fourth year planters dries up, what are the vet companies going to do? They're going to have to hire less experienced people potentially. That means putting more effort and putting more resources into their training program. I think also we're going to see the production safety relationship in focus. We're talking about unprecedented volumes, hitting 318 million seedlings. That's a lot. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of trucks on the road. I think we've neglected the analysis between production and safety. I think that's a critical part of looking at the way mills operate, when they're looking at injuries per however many 100,000 board feet or such. But I think that's an area that we need to start looking at. That maybe comes into play with our data analysis. But when it comes to training, I think that people need to also think about getting their money's worth. Your training program is your first, few days of work for the seasonal operators. You really want to, you are giving something to your workers, so this is an opportunity to ask more. This is the best possible time to raise your expectations for what you're getting back from your workers, because you are also giving them more, and your training program is the opportunity to get that message across. Maybe a softer, more sort of communications point is about kids these days, millennials. Does anybody here know what the generation is after millennials? Who knows? What's that? Gen Z, exactly. Generation Z, what are they? They are different than millennials. They're more similar than they are different, but this does come into play in terms of what people are looking at for jobs, and particularly the kinds of training that they're going to be offered. I had to do a little bit of work on this. Like, my kid is 4 years old. He's definitely, I don't know what his generation is, but connecting with Gen Z, looking at the summary of some of the things that are used to describe Generation Z really make me think about training programs and what people are doing to bring workers into the industry. They're considered to be more pragmatic, more cautious, and more money conscious. That Generation Z has grown up learning a different level of frugality due to economic conditions. Millennials grew up with parents that had maybe a little bit more wiggle room. They're increasingly skeptical to formal education. I find that very interesting. I definitely sort of see that playing out in terms of jobs that I see workers looking at. So they're less educated, more early starts, and more entrepreneurial. They're looking for opportunities. So we have to look at our training programs. Can they appeal to that? Can we offer them opportunities and opportunities for progression through our training programs instead of just a job that they're going to do for maybe a few years? Because one of the defining characteristics of millennials and Gen Z is that they're looking for short-term employment, careers that maybe they're ready to move on from after 3 years. If we can provide opportunities within our training program which will lead towards progression, that will help appeal to that particular cultural facet of the generation. And we're talking about an industry where the word culture is thrown around a lot, the culture of tree planting, the culture of forestry. Well, there's a culture for the generation as well that we need to connect with. And I think that we maybe need to reevaluate that. What we offer young people in the past is not the same as what we offer them today. They want to be difference makers. That's another thing. I think it was 84% of millennials want to make a difference in the world. There's a similar trend with Generation Z in terms of how we market and broadcast the job and what they're going to be doing, talking about making a difference. That's a bit of a challenge in terms of branding the industry. They're also very tech dependent. Big difference between Generation Z and millennials is Generation Z, they grew up with technology immediately. Millennials actually had to make a bit of that transition. They grew up, still some of them, with cursive handwriting, with some of the non-computerized interfaces. Generation Z is going to be completely and wholly started with technology as one of their primary forms of communication, and that needs to be considered in the way we deliver our training programs. The interesting thing about what is said about Generation Z is that although they're very tech dependent, they place a huge emphasis on face-to-face communication. It's almost like a rebound effect, like they need that more than ever because they're so immersed in technology. So for people to start considering about how do you want to go about delivering your training, how am I going to make the best connection with my new recruits and my new trainees? Am I going to just stick them down in front of a computer monitor and have them press the Y button over and over again? Or is there going to be a little bit more face-to-face interaction? Sometimes you can't replace that time where you actually get to communicate people and use a little bit of body language, use a little bit of your tone of voice, and use some live demonstrations to get them involved. So benefits of a robust training program. These are tools for growing businesses and industries. That's the most important thing, is that entire industries have gone through reevaluating their structure of training for their employees. Construction Ready, for example, is a tool that's being used by the BC construction industry where high school students can start acquiring some of the building blocks of competency for going into that job. It's a way to respond to client and agency concerns. I would note that there is a review of CORE happening. It is ongoing. The specific content of that CORE review and what it means about what you need to do in your training program, we don't know where that's going yet. I think if we look generally around Western society and look at the direction of labor regulation, it tends towards being a little bit stricter and demanding more of companies. It demands more and more of them to be able to point to an established standard that they can say, this is how I train people. So that should be a little bit of pressure on us as an industry to formalize what we're doing, get ahead of the curve, and be ready for some of the things that will be demanded of us. I look back to the beginning of BC Forest Safe, when we called it the BC Forest Safety Council, and I look at the way people responded to the new training demands that were placed upon them. It was all of a sudden sprung upon them. All of a sudden we have this audit. Holy crap, what do I do? They're looking around and thinking, I need this form, I need that form, anybody have a template? And they went about and they sort of quickly rebuilt their training programs, and that created a lot of the problems and challenges we're experiencing today. Is that we were reacting to a sudden demand for documentation and checklists, so we ran out and grabbed documentation and checklists without thinking critically about what we were trying to accomplish. We have an opportunity now to actually be a little bit more proactive and put together a more systematic sort of training model for workers in our industry that'll help us adapt to future pressures and future demands. Benefit of a robust training program is corrective actions. I'll make that point over and over again, that when you have a major incident, you really need to look at your training program as one of your primary avenues for making a corrective action. And the reason is that that is a corrective action that's in your control. That is something that you can actually effectively exert almost total control over as an employer. So that's a huge opportunity and a huge benefit. It is a way of establishing relationships and hierarchies. We don't talk about hierarchies enough. It almost becomes a bit of a subject we want to get away from. And again, I'm not defaulting just to planting, but in a lot of forestry environments, I think the population of workers, there's an idea that everybody wants to be treated as equals, and that's good. I support those values, but there needs to be a hierarchy, particularly when it comes to doing tasks right or emergencies. Training is a great time to establish those hierarchies, and it's a great time to set the culture for your organization. That's when your most important message gets across. And structuring your training with safety first. We say safety first, but is it first? When you do your training program, do you go through an intensive safety module as the very first thing, or do other things come next? If we're going to say safety first, our training program is the time where that needs to happen. I've already touched a little bit about the branding and the appeal of the job, that this is about the future of the industry. This is really the primary tool that we're going to shape our workforce with. And when you think of our workforce, that's one of the defining characteristics of this industry and the people in this room, is that unlike many other industries, you share your workers. It's the one resource that you pass around the room over and over and over again. We have very much rotating doors. What companies do is really affecting other companies' practice. So there is a bit of a group migration that needs to occur in terms of building the industry's training program, and that is going to affect the branding and the appeal of the job. And it is our most powerful tool for change.